О, Тръмп спасява Милей. Това ще го изгледаме. Това е 8-минутно видео, да, ще го пусна на 1.25. Да видим какво става с Хавиер Милей. Защото Хавиер Милей му е много тежко напоследък. Аржентинците направо, че ги
Argentina's President Milei has had a tough few months. His approval ratings have been slipping, his La Libertad Avanza party got battered at the Buenos Aires provincial elections a couple of weeks ago, and perhaps most importantly, the Argentinian peso has been steadily declining.
И му се ебава майката. Изпревари му, той беше въвел една мярка да се обезценява песото с 2% на месец, нещо такова, за да бори инфлацията и за да държи износа, аржентинския износ конкурентен. Ама обаче валутата се срива.
Inflation and straining Argentina's meager foreign exchange reserves. However, earlier this week, Milei received a sudden respite when US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that the US taxpayer will be essentially bailing Argentina out. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why Milei needs a bailout from the US and whether it will actually work.
Ще се съберат с Тръмп, дружинка, детелинка, мръсни анархокапиталисти. Макар че, ако трябва да сме честни, не е много анархокапиталистическо да въведеш такива мита, но както и да е.
We did a whole video on this a couple of days ago, so go and check that out if you want to know more. But the TLDR is that the Argentinian peso wasn't doing as well as Milei hoped it would. For context, before Milei, the peso essentially had two exchange rates. The official rate, claimed and managed by the government, and the unofficial or actual market rate, known as the blue rate. When Milei took charge in late 2023, the official rate was around 370 to the dollar, while the unofficial rate was about 1,000 to the dollar. In other words, the government was pretending that the peso was worth about 3 times as much as it actually was.
Но не става за чеп за зелен, не можеш да си купиш долари в никое change бюро на 370 песо.
Now, in a way, the simplest thing that Milei could have done would just be to immediately devalue the official rate to the unofficial rate, which would have essentially unified the currency and allowed the peso to float.
И всички щеха да станат гигабедни внезапно. Ама е така. 2/3 от парите ти изчезват.
i.e. have its value determined by market forces, like most other currencies in the world. However, despite his stated commitment to free markets, Milei
Повечето, защото ние имаме валутен борд. Мале да живее борда.
He knew that such a dramatic devaluation would trigger a massive increase in inflation. This is because Argentinian households import lots of stuff, so a steep devaluation in the peso would make all of these imports more expensive, thus pushing up inflation. Such a massive spike in inflation would both destabilize the economy and risk undermining Milei's popularity, which would in turn make it harder for him to push his reforms through Congress, where his party only has minimal representation, or convince investors that any of the reforms he did get through would actually stick. After all, the lower Milei's poll numbers fall, the more likely it is that his reforms will ultimately be undone by his successors. Anyway, the key thing to know about Milei's peso policy is that he knows the free market thing to do would be to let it float, but
Обаче
didn't want to devalue it too fast for the fear of stoking inflation.
Не само инфлацията, хората ще обеднеят зверски.
Milei did dramatically devalue the peso's official rate by about 50% literally 3 days after taking office, but it was still overvalued, and this triggered a dramatic spike in inflation, with month-on-month inflation rising to 25.5% in December. To avoid
И въпреки това за 6 месеца им стабилизира инфлацията. Фактори по-ниско, отколкото беше.
further stoking inflation, Milei refrained from another large devaluation and instead moved to what's known as a crawling peg, devaluing the peso by 2% each month.
Да, 2% всеки месец.
With the idea that the official rate would eventually catch up
Ще се догонят, и се догониха.
unofficial rate.
И почна да се срива.
While inflation did stabilize somewhat, the two rates never converged because the peso's unofficial rate kept declining even faster than the crawling peg. So in April of this year, Milei took the leap, scrapped most capital controls and let the peso float, essentially unifying the two rates. Originally, it looked like a massive success, and the peso stabilized at around 1,100 to the dollar, well above Milei's stated lower bound of 1,400, which meant Milei didn't have to use any of his IMF dollars to defend it. However, in recent months, the peso has started coming under pressure. Things started going downhill in
Никой не иска песота.
July, when the peso posted a sharp decline after economic data published that month suggested that Argentina's economy wasn't doing brilliantly, contracting slightly in May and June. Then in August, leaked recordings implied that Milei's sister, who is probably his closest political confidant, had been stealing millions of dollars from Argentina's
Така, Милей е мръсно корумпе.
disability agency. This triggered a steep decline in Milei's poll ratings, sparking anxiety among investors that Milei now lacked the political capital
Милей корумпе, маци. Лошо.
make his reforms stick. Milei was able to keep the peso above its lower limit by raising reserve requirements for banks. In other words, demanding that banks buy more pesos to artificially create demand for pesos.
Което означава, че като вдигне търсенето за валутата, автоматично стойността й се увеличава. Икономика.
When Milei's party got battered at the Buenos Aires provincial elections earlier this month, the sell-off accelerated, and fiddling with reserve requirements wasn't going to cut it. In a last-ditch attempt to defend the peso, Milei started burning through IMF dollars, buying pesos on international markets. Despite
IMF, Международен валутен фонд. International Monetary Fund.
Literally promising the IMF that he'd never do this, and thus essentially ruling out further IMF support. Milei promptly burnt through about 5% of Argentina's $20 billion in liquid foreign exchange reserves in just 3 days, and things were looking pretty dicey. That was until Monday evening, when US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent took to X to announce that the US would essentially bail Milei out.
И това е защото Милей иска да доларифицира икономиката на Аржентина, да разкара песото изцяло, и като доларифицира икономиката, Федералния резерв ще може да установи контрол и върху тази огромна икономика, която е аржентинска.
Why is the US bailing Milei lay out? Well, in comments to the media, Bezos said, "We're sending a message that if you do the right thing, if you follow good policies, if you're aligned with the values of the United States, then we're willing to provide assistance when things move out of equilibrium." And well, this sort of makes sense, given that Trump and Milei are both well-known standard bearers of the international right, who thus presumably want to support one another. But we should note that when it comes to actual policies, Milei and Trump are miles apart. Trump loves tariffs, failed to...
Да, точно това е. Тръмп е анархокапиталист, който обича мита, което е много странно.
meaningfully cut
Милей е просто анархокапиталист. Той е ненормален. Милей излезе и каза: боли ме хуя за монополи. Всеки други такива изчадия на свободните пазари. Нека.
spending and is constantly intervening in the economy, even buying up stakes in companies. Conversely, Milei is an impassioned advocate of free trade, who did actually massively cut public spending and privatize basically every industry he could. Anyway, will this actually work out? Well, maybe a bit. Besant's announcement has apparently stemmed the sell-off, and a stronger peso might help Milei electorally by tamping down inflation. Nonetheless, it's unlikely to be enough to restore Milei to his former glory, given that the main reason that Milei's approval ratings have slumped is the corruption scandal. And
Защо просто не осъди сестра си на
it's also
прати в Пуерто Рико, теко е колония или Ел Салвадор.
pretty embarrassing, given that Milei came to power promising that free market economics would save Argentina, only to then need a bailout from both the IMF and the US. More fundamentally though, a bailout won't solve the fundamental problem, namely that Argentina's economy has apparently stalled and Argentinian exports have been weak, which is the main reason the peso is under pressure and that Argentina's trade account has flipped back into deficit. The media...
То е взаимно позитив фидбак луп. Валутата ти изнасяш, пребваш валутата, не можеш да изнасяш, пребваш валутата, не можеш да изнасяш, пребваш валутата, не можеш да изнасяш, пребваш валутата. Много добро видео. Много добре ги обясняват тия работи.